right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this next session. So my name is Ellen Boehm, and I'm the SVP of IoT strategy at a company called Keyfactor. We're a cybersecurity software company. We specialize in certificates and certificate management. But I'm really excited to be here with these fellow panelists who are experts in their fields and the focus of our talk today, which is cybersecurity and IoT. So we have, again, 40 minutes and a lot of things to talk about. So not sure if we'll have time for Q&A, but if we do, we can entertain that. Otherwise, find us afterwards. We're happy to talk. So with that, actually, I would like everyone just say your name and say your company very quickly. We'll just go down the line for intros, and then we're just going to get right into the questions. So.
Eric Greenwald, General Counsel of Finite State.
Hi, Eric Brenneis. I'm the CEO of Vodafone's IoT business.
Hi, Grégory Laloy. I'm responsible for the product and IoT within Thales.
Sri Ramachandran, CTO of Somos.
Trish Riley, Senior Director Product Marketing at Aris Communications.
Awesome. Thank you all for joining me. And then lastly, just want to say thank you to the IMC for sponsoring this panel. So we are members of the IMC, which is an organization that brings together several different companies and people from around the space to talk about best practices around IoT. Specifically, the initiative that we've been taking on this year in partnership with the GCF is taking a look at the cybersecurity standards and guidelines that are emerging and trying to have some practical advice for companies to be able to adopt and implement those across the multiple layers of the IoT stack. So not just a device perspective, but from the network and the connectivity and then the cloud and the apps. So that's a little side note about some of the things that we're doing. We'll talk a little bit more about that today. But without further ado, let's jump into the questions because I really want to hear from the experts. So we're going to start with Sri and setting the stage about just generally the IoT landscape. What are you seeing? Obviously, a lot of IoT that we've seen here at CES, but from your perspective, what do you think are the hot trends?
Yeah, so that's a great question to get started off with. So we talk of IoT, and then in general, people think IoT needs to be like small devices, small sensors, and so on. But when you look at it realistically, any connected device is essentially part of that ecosystem, right? So it can be an airliner, a Boeing or Airbus airliner. That's a connected device, really, multiple connections. And it could be like a coffee maker with an alarm clock that you can actually program remotely, right? So that essentially is, again, another connected device. So connected devices have a pretty broad range of applications, and typically there is a device that has some way of connecting through a network to a back-end app or application and so on. So this is, in general, what the IoT is. And what we are actually seeing is that based on analysts' research and so on, the consensus estimate is that there are 18 billion devices already deployed. So that's a significant number. And when we look at the growth rate of this, the consensus estimate is also 18.8% compound annual growth rate. So it's a very significantly growing market. And pretty much when you look at what is actually driving this growth, obviously the different types of network modalities are actually increasing. So originally it was just Wi-Fi and cellular, and then there was LoRa, and then there are so many new ways to actually connect devices to a network. And there are two key areas that are actually driving a lot of this expansion. Obviously, there's industrial automation that is a huge part of the growth of IoT. And I think the thing that we all probably experience on a daily basis is that any device that we buy for the home now comes connected. So we just had a refrigerator that went bad. It was a 25-year-old refrigerator. And I had to buy a new one on the 24th of December. Fortunately, there was a great sale at Lowe's, so I said, yes, let me go get it. And every refrigerator had a Wi-Fi connection. So you cannot find an appliance without a connection these days, right? So connected devices, especially smart home-based connected devices, is another area that's actually driving this growth. So it's really an expanding market. It's very relevant to all of us, and it's going to be something that we need to be much more in tune with.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Awesome, thanks, Sri. So Eric, I want to go to you now to talk a little bit about the connectivity and the networking part of it. So obviously at Vodafone, I'm sure you have some expertise here, but how do we support then connecting all of these millions of things globally, wherever they are, as Sri was mentioning, the volumes?
I think there are 3 points to this. On one hand, it's the network technology itself. 10 years ago, everything was on 2G, and 2G, of course, was and is a good technology, but for a smart meter, the new technology, narrowband IoT is better. For a super fast device, or if you want to download big amounts of data, 5G is better. So we've gone to a point where we have lots of network technologies, LTE-M, 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, RedCap, and so on. So you can now select the right network technology for your connection. Number 2, 10 years ago, IoT was more a technology, which was used, and now, in our opinion, it's an operational asset. There are so many customers now already who depend completely on the IoT connections for their business model, that it's an operational asset which needs to be available 100% of the time. 99% is not good enough. And number 3, there have also been technological developments with regards to how you access the networks. It used to be a physical SIM, which you need to put in there. Now you have eSIM, where you can switch the SIM over the air. You have iSIM, where it's embedded in the silicon of a communication module. And of course, these new technologies make everything more flexible, but also pose new security risks, because obviously if you can switch a network over the air, there's more room for fraud than if it's hard-coded and you can never change it.
Awesome, thank you. So Greg, let's dive a little bit into security. So what are you seeing from the general cybersecurity landscape that we should be aware of today?
So there is a lot when we talk about IoT security. Most of the time, as Sri was mentioning, IoT is growing. There is more and more connected devices, independently of the type of connectivity, cellular connectivity, Wi-Fi, BLE, and others. We need to find a way to protect those IoT devices. When we talk about IoT security, as we were mentioning also in the beginning, it's not only on the hardware side, but we need to see the full value chain, from the production of the device, when the device will be manufactured, and when the device will be running during the lifetime. And we need to take care of that since the beginning of the design of the devices. Then the device is one thing. You need to have a secure device. That's something that is important. I think Iris was mentioning the eSIM and the SIM, that in the end is a kind of a root of trust, an hardware root of trust, where we can put, let's say, the foundations of the security inside. But then we have also all, let's say, the technology to exchange the data that needs to be secure. All the data that will transit from the device to the application server needs to be secure as well. And you need also to have the capability to manage the secure life cycle of your device through firmware signing service, and different things like that. So IoT security is big, and it depends also on the type of applications. What you do with a smart metering or grid is not the same as a pet tracker. It's not the same when we are talking about healthcare or automotive that can be linked also to safety. So there is a lot of things that needs to be taken into consideration.
Yeah, and I think hopefully we can get a little bit more into that in the future questions, because I do think that there's things that we can learn cross-industry, right? Especially if we're looking at the framework of end-to-end cybersecurity and looking at an endpoint or an operating system, or how do you encrypt and secure the channels. So I think finding similarities and helping to share that across verticals is important. But yeah, let's get a little bit more into that in a bit. So Trish, last thing in terms of setting the stage from a perspective from you. You have experience across fintech, across healthcare. So what are you seeing in terms of cybersecurity in these areas that we should be aware of?
Yeah, sorry, no, that's a really great question. Even based on things that Sri was saying and Greg was saying, a lot of this, if you think of it from a security perspective, the industry itself, security, we have to think of it as being more horizontal. It is not a vertical play. Yes, there are differences within the vertical arenas as to how things are used, what you need to protect, what type of data and stuff is critical to your organization from both an operational and a revenue and a business perspective. But at the same point, you need to think about the fact that different industries or different verticals are going to latch onto security faster than others will. I mean, financial services is always an early adapter from a security perspective. However, the issues and the challenges that you see within healthcare, that you see in manufacturing, that you see in consumer business, it's very, very similar. So you need to think about how you want to protect this from a holistic perspective. And even though you may have a business that has, multiple different types of security parameters, you could be a holding company and you have things in consumer, you have things in maybe in travel and logistics or, the different areas. The threats you need to also think about are, how can anybody or what can be used to potentially get into my infrastructure? We see a lot of changes right now with zero-day attacks. People don't know what do I do? How do I start to do this? And you feel a lot of people that get this instant, oh my gosh, how am I going to handle this scenario? In which you just need to think about it, okay, you're 0 day, things are going to happen. Everybody to some extent is going to be attacked or probably has been and may or may not know it. You need to think about the fact that, we need to put something in place that can start to traverse and start to understand what's going on within the infrastructure from the security perspective, regardless of the type of device. IoT is a huge threat right now. It is a big security gap. Everybody's been talking about the fact that these devices have kind of grown, as Shri and everybody said, exponentially. It's kind of become the Wild West. And then everybody's kind of thinking about now going, I need to build security into this, but what do I do about those devices that have sat out there for years? Because IoT devices were originally designed to be in areas where you didn't have to have a person go out to them, or you didn't have to have accessibility. And it really, was kind of the lone wolf out there. But now you need to start to think, it's got old hardware, it may have old firmware, there may be things hard-coded in this. These are potential threats into your infrastructure. So regardless of the vertical, a lot of the challenges are still the same. It's how you handle those and think of really what your business priorities are.
Yeah, thank you, Trish. That was a great lead into this next section, which I really do want to have focused on threats and challenges. And actually, as I was walking over here this morning, I was thinking about this story, and now it's 7 years old, but when the casino was hacked because there was a fish tank with a smart thermostat that had no security on it. So as we go into this next section, if anyone else has other stories that they'd like to share, let's come up with some more relevant ones. I know there's recently, I think, what is this, the Salt Typhoon, talking about telecom attacks. So maybe, I think we're getting a lot better. We've gotten a lot better at securing enterprise networks, enterprise devices, servers, laptops, even within companies. But then what's the next front that attackers and bad actors are going after? It's these, again, maybe smaller devices that can be turned into like bot attacks, or just entryways to get into a corporate network or into this casino network, for example, or get into into a retail facility because you hacked into the HVAC system. So let's talk a little bit about some of those threats and challenges. And Eric, I would like to go over to you. So what are some of the top challenges that you've heard companies are facing today?
Well, I'll start by echoing what Trish was saying, is that depending upon your vertical, depending upon the services you provide, depending upon the kind of data you traffic in, depending upon your geography, the challenges are going to vary considerably from company to company, from vertical to vertical. But there are some practical considerations that are, if not universal, near universal, and it's the way I would shorthand it is resource constraints. That there is so much that needs to be done, that can be done, that where there are customer pressures, market pressures, regulatory pressures that you are under as a company, especially in the IoT space, to do, but you have limited resources with which to do it. And Gregory and I were talking about this before the panel, that a good way to describe that or to think about that is as a cost constraint or the economic pressures in the IoT space. It's not true for all IoT companies, but for many, they are, the marketplace competition is fierce, and they are under a lot of pressure to keep their prices very low. When your prices are very low, you have limited resources with which to address various needs. Cybersecurity is going to be chief among those, and there are lots of companies that, as Trish said, you bolt it on afterwards, because when you're first starting out, you're worried about building it, you're worried about getting it to market, and you're worried about actually selling it at a competitive price. And so a lot of companies are coming late to cybersecurity in their products, in their space, in their services, not necessarily out of either ignorance or disdain for security practices, but just because they have other priorities. The incentive structure and the risks in the marketplace are structured around a narrow focus on delivering at low price points. And while this is certainly true for inexpensive consumer electronics, it also applies to areas where there are components going into automobiles, into airplanes, where there's still a lot of pressure to keep prices low, and there's a lot of competition, and it's a dynamic marketplace. So it is, again, sort of this lack of resources, economic resources, to be able to devote to a complex problem where there isn't one single, biggest challenge. It really just depends upon what you're doing, where you are, and what sort of threats you face.
Yeah, great points. I think a lot of it is about, it's an ROI decision too, designing in security, and also sometimes taking a risk of a breach. So I know at Key Factor, we've done a study where it's, the cost of a breach could be $2 million. So do you want to just pay that, or do you want to be more prescriptive up front to prevent it?
Well, and it's worth noting that, and we're going to talk, I'm sure, a little bit later about the regulatory schemes that are now entering into the marketplace globally, but leading up to this point, it was really that cost risk calculus, cost-benefit analysis of, okay, if I don't really go do everything that I should be doing with respect to cybersecurity, what's the impact? And part of it depends on how likely am I to suffer a breach. And a lot of companies are willing to roll the dice and just say, it's hard to internalize a cost that hasn't happened and that might not.
Right. Yeah. But let's talk about the certifications in a bit. So next question, so Trish and maybe also Eric, about connectivity and risks around connectivity and infrastructure. So what challenges, I think if we go specifically into that sort of network layer, are you guys seeing?
Yeah, so if you think about it from the connectivity perspective, from the cellular side of the house, your cellular traffic runs through your existing, infrastructure and everything. But the challenge that you have is you start to think about it not just from connectivity, and of course I'm going to bend more toward the security side because that is my background. You have to think about the fact that a lot of that data that's brought in from the connectivity is very much aggregated. So you don't know, and what happens if you have one device that's going awry, or if you have one device that has really opened an attack surface for you? How do you figure out which device it is versus selling or setting off everything? Okay, this business unit, because it's part of that's got to be shut down, or no connectivity till we figure out what's going on. What's really important to think about from the connectivity side of the house is, how do you start to bring all this together and really understand it from a device perspective? Because you want to be able to frame that one device, look at what it's interacting with, what it's potentially dialing out. Is it going out to a command and control center? Is there malware threats associated with it? All of these, and I'm, like I said, going to bring this back to the security side. It's very similar to what you've done from a network side of the house, but you also need to think about it from the connectivity side of the house. Do you have things to add to that, Eric? Or?
Look, yeah, I fully agree with everything you've been saying. Regarding your question, how important is it on connectivity? Think about it. Connectivity, something that is not connected, can only be attacked if you go physically there, right? A computer which doesn't have an internet connection, you need to physically go there to manipulate. So therefore, connectivity is actually the entry point for any remote attacker. And therefore, you need to secure it appropriately. And I think we'll talk in the next questions about how we do that, right?
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so Greg, let's talk a little bit about how do you see companies managing IoT security when it's massive deployments?
That's a very good question, because I think, as Shri was mentioning, we see there are more and more IoT devices. And when you manage those type of devices, and a million of devices that will be connected, you need to start from the beginning. If, in terms of company, you don't have a mindset of security by design, then it's a little bit too late. There are things that can be done, you can patch, there are things that can be done, but once the device is in the field, if you don't have remotely the capacity to do something, it's going to be very complex. So the way to do it, there are different steps that you need to do, and it's the same as some organization has done in the past. You are talking about the IT. IT has done it. The OT monitoring, we manage security services, they are doing it. But it takes time, it's a process, and every actors on the IoT must be part of this journey. It's coming from the silicon vendor who are bridging a little bit more and more security inside. It's the device maker who needs also to program and to help the end user to have some security mechanism on it. It's also the service provider, the one who will deploy the device to also have the capability to do things. So we really need to think as a kind of a 360 offering from the design up to the devices in the field and then the refurbish as well. Because this is where it's going to be key. You need to think globally to that.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to start to shift into the solutions. But before we do that, so Shri, maybe one last question to kind of help lead us into that. So how is the cybersecurity community developing best practices and guidelines to help companies navigate these challenges that we've just been talking about? So what are you seeing in that space?
Well, so it's been kind of interesting because people look at it, I mean, if you take a typical IoT system, there's a device, there's a network, there's an application. And so when they come up with standards and regulations around, or come up with standards to say how to secure this, they're looking at it from network and application, which are easy, I shouldn't say easy. There are existing best practices that they can bring to it to make it all happen, like from the IT side, right? But devices are very unique. It's not a laptop. It's not something like a router or something that's known. So now device ecosystems are very fragmented because you create a device for a particular use case. Yep. So which means it may have its own operating system, or maybe even a proprietary operating system. And the skill set to manage those devices, to make sure that those devices are secure, are really hard. That's a big challenge, right? So companies cannot hire enough people that understand all of that. So just as you were talking about the whole life cycle, it's almost like the device manufacturer has to make sure that the skill sets translate or get sold along with those devices to make sure that enterprises understand those challenges of managing those devices.
Yeah, good. Okay, so let's get into some of the specifics, and thank you, Shri. So Eric, we'll go to you first. Sure. What key standards are IoT companies needing to be aware of these days? Because I know there's a lot of them. There's regional ones, there's vertical-based ones. So, but let's just talk about a couple here that might be very relevant for the group.
Well, yeah, and there's obviously a lot to say here, so feel free to cut me off if we need to move on. But as we were discussing earlier, it has historically principally been just a question of what's the risk of breach or some sort of catastrophic loss and the potential lawsuits that might result from that. Now things have shifted a bit more to the question of what sort of penalties might I face if I do end up having a breach or some operating problem with my system as a result of cybersecurity. And I would say that the dominant force in this arena is the EU Cybersecurity Resilience Act, which just got finalized at the end of 2024. It'll begin coming into force in 2026, but and fully in force in 2027. But now, well before then, now you are seeing companies that are requiring their vendors to demonstrate their compliance with the CRA because design cycles are long enough that you can't say, oh, I'll wait until 2026 and then see whether I or my vendors are in compliance. You have to be much more proactive than that. With the CRA, the potential penalties are significant, from massive fines to denial of market access to the EU. And this is something in the same way that California vehicle emission standards end up driving vehicle emission standards for the entirety of the United States. The standards that the EU is setting will end up driving global cybersecurity standards, because as long as you are selling into the EU or you sell to a company that sells into the EU, you're going to be subject in one way or another to the Cyber Resilience Act. And so this is the conversation that we are having over and over again. And it's interesting to note that we've sort of seen this ratcheting up slowly, the awareness in the United States, I should say, because in Europe, I think there's been, whether because of the GDPR or because it's obvious that there's been this strong move in the direction of cybersecurity regulations that will carry significant penalties. There's been, I think, higher level of awareness among European companies of what is out there now and what is coming. That awareness is just starting to shift dramatically in the United States. We've seen it go gradually shifting, but it is becoming more pronounced. Now, and as you mentioned, there are all sorts of standards, international, regional, vertical specific, and it's a complicated environment. But one thing that is, and the idea of, I'm sure that the idea of trying to figure out how do I comply with all this is daunting for most companies. But the one significant piece of good news is that these standards, these certifications, the requirements, they're all borrowing from one another, and they're based on a fairly robust set of common criteria. And it is possible to focus on those common criteria. Once you make sure that your company is aligned with those, then it's the effort to obtain the Singapore certification or ensure that you're in compliance with the CRA is not as big of a step. I don't want to trivialize it, because it's still, there are a lot of specifics in the different regional standards and requirements, but once you look at those core common requirements that are a lot of the very basic blocking and tackling of cybersecurity, if you can cross that bar, you've come a long way towards meeting the broader and multifaceted requirements that you see internationally.
That was great advice. And I do agree. I feel like I've heard the CRA talked about in the light of GDPR, but bigger and more impactful. So it is something that I think is a big deal. And a good point about being a vendor or a supplier to a larger maybe operator or OEM machine builder, right? That you're going to need to be responsible. So.
Right, and that construct is one that you saw play out in the United States when the U.S. government, dating from my time at the White House in the Obama administration, there was still high level of fear about imposing mandatory cybersecurity regulations on industry, except with some exceptions, one being Department of Defense procurement, where Department of Defense was willing to impose certain requirements on DoD contractors selling directly into the government, but those trickle down and out to all the companies that supply DoD contractors, and you see the same thing happening with CRA, with other cybersecurity regulations.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you.
Can I add a little bit to that? Because I think something that's also really important to think about is, if you think about it from an organizational perspective, you've got all of these different regulations that are coming at you. You're like, what do I do? And you talked a great deal about the commonalities between all of them, which is important. But in order to think back as to how you want to really protect that, you've got to think about the data and how the data is going to be used and where the data is of utmost importance. So you want to figure out something. You want to figure out a way to really, if you're a global organization, you have to be able to unify the user experience. You have to be able to make this work throughout all of your organizations globally. And that's also another part that I think the regulations are kind of trying to get there, but I don't think they quite know how, because it's really difficult. I mean, you've got the different verticals, you've got everything else that's going on. So, don't panic, I guess, is the best thing that I'm trying to lay out here. Just think about what's the core and what's the most important, and gradually get there. It's like everything else. It's like putting on one shoe at a time, dressing in the morning, putting on, one pant leg at a time.
Yeah, and I think that's also why we are here as partners and cybersecurity experts to sort of help there as well. So thank you. So Greg, let's go to your perspective. How are these regulations driving behavior? Are you seeing different customers coming to you? I mean, obviously, Thales has a lot of expertise around this area, but what are you seeing from behavior changes as a result of this?
So the first is, I think one thing that was said is that when you are looking at IoT devices, it's always, there are IoT devices that are expensive, but most of them, they are very cost sensitive. So when you are talking about security, always there is a price. And in the past, it was difficult for people to say, should I put that on top of my bomb? How can I manage it and so on? It's complex. I already have my IT. So they say, okay, from the IT infrastructure, maybe I can do something, but it was limited. And that was the real difficulty. Now, when the Sierra will impose fines, the red was already there, the US trust mark also in the US will come. I think it's changing completely the mindset of the overall ecosystem, or the overall value chain on the IoT, people know, say, I have to do something. I have to protect my device, and they will be proactive. The main difficulty that they have is that it's not the same when you are talking about security for the IT or the OT monitoring. IoT is completely different, and it's new. And I think with the way we see it, we see a lot of companies that are a little bit lost on the regulation, exactly what it means for them, what they have to do. If they have to go inside, it means, I think that was the point of Sri, they need to have experts to understand exactly the way to do it. So they should turn to companies who can help them on understanding what it means for them, making kind of threat assessment, consultancy services, review of the architecture, just to help them to understand what are the different things that they will have to put in place to be compliant to those regulations and new standards. So for us and for everyone, I think here, it's a benefit because at least all the things that we have done, all the investment that we have done on cybersecurity will lead and will pave the way to help customers on those engagements, and we need to support them on making the right implementation on what they have to do to be compliant to that. And I think today we're only talking about compliancy. If in the future there will be a need also to certify those products, that could come, that's another step that will come. And when you go for certification, that's another level of what needs to be done.
Can I just add one thing?
Yes, please.
Quickly on because you were asking about behavior changes, and
Yep.
one of the questions we're getting a lot, and internal questions that companies are asking, is about supply chain. And if you look at the focus of some of the bigger movements in the United States, regulation of cybersecurity focus around China and supply chain. And so we get a lot of questions on, do I need to stop using Chinese components? Do I need to stop having R&D done in China? And to echo what Gregory was saying, there's a lot of ambiguity. It's hard to know exactly how some of the regulations and some of the work that Department of Commerce is doing, whether the connected vehicle rule, whether their proposed drone rule, data centers are next, there's investigations of wireless routers. Like it's hard to know exactly how this is going to be enforced and what limits the US government is going to impose on supply chain going through China, which is an incredibly challenging question because the supply chain is inherently global and most roads go through China on the way to delivering an IoT product. And so that is a behavioral question that a lot of companies have been coming to us to ask about. What do we need to do with respect to supply chain in order to address this question about restrictions on supply chain?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, I know from my perspective, at my company, we're all about authentication, encryption, secure connections, and identity-based, with certificates in order to connect to a device and then be able to push firmware that you have signed and that you know the origin of that. So a lot of it is about trust and establishing trust at all the layers. So trusting the hardware and the components and the chipsets that you're using, and then being able to trust all the software that runs on it. So doing the full risk assessments and understanding, are there any open source? And we've been doing this for years now, but I think it's becoming more and more important to be able to know that, what sort of code is running inside of your devices and inside of the system. So there's some basic things around, again, secure firmware updates and updatability and all of that I think we're seeing coming out in these standards that's important to have processes around. And it's not just, to Trish's point earlier, it's not just once and done, it's an evolution. And because we've deployed these devices, whether in a connected vehicle, whether they're connected smart meters, and they're deployed everywhere, and it's a big pain to go out to them. We have to be able to connect to them remotely, securely, to be able to maintain this over time. So anyway, just a little bit of my side there. So let's go, Eric, from a Vodafone perspective, what do you guys do to help your customers navigate this, specifically, solution-wise?
Yep, and I think that fits in very well with what the colleagues here have been saying, also including standards. So first of all, what we do is, for any customer, we do not just make our own system, which is the connectivity secure. We really look from the customer's device all the way into the customer system, the transport of data, that needs to be secure. And we are the specialists for the connectivity part of this. And at the same time, we also consult the customer on how to secure their hardware and how to secure the interfaces we have. You mentioned it yourself. Our connectivity service is secure by design. From the beginning, we've always watched out that all the potential entry points, such as entering the data tunnel or addressing a device is impossible with our IoT connectivity service. In previous times, 10 years ago, lots of IoT companies still put a consumer SIM into their device. If you knew the phone number of that consumer SIM, you could just call it, reverse engineer some commands, and you're inside the system. That's impossible. We have authentication mechanisms, we have encryption, we monitor the data tunnel, and recently we've also started to use AI in order to understand the specific behavior of each device which is out there, and if a device behaves differently from the expectation, if, for example, a meter starts sending loads and loads of data, even though you only expect the register value, then we look deeper into that and see, is that a problem? Finally, we also build on all the investments into the security systems that Vodafone has done, and we also consult our customers, and we stick to all the standards that you mentioned before and you also mentioned.
Okay, thank you. So Trish, maybe one more for you. Anything else to add about what Eris does specifically to help your customers with this?
Yes, I mean, very, very similar. Because of the way that Eris was originally, brought up and developed in the industry, we've been around for more than 30 years. And the fact that we were originally built on a connectivity, we have our own core network. We partner with all of the big MNOs, MVNOs, or I shouldn't say all, almost all of them, in which we help them, as they're protecting the infrastructure and those types of things, we look at it from a perspective of it's a new product we're getting ready to launch out called our Watchtower solution, in which we can sit there and look at suspicious, malicious, abnormal activity that is occurring within the devices. We allow you to turn around and think about it from a per device perspective, like I'd mentioned earlier. If I'm seeing some type of anomaly, or if I'm seeing the device all of a sudden calling out, I might want to say, you know what, I need to sequester this one device without taking the whole infrastructure down or without taking the whole group down, because you need to maintain some of this interaction that's going on. But our solution itself allows you to really look at it and start to put together policies and programs. And because of the fact that we have done this from what we classified as the core network and working with all the big partners out there, the carrier partners, it allows us to really create a unified user experience. So what you can create from policies, regardless of which carrier you're using under the covers, really allows us to, or you as the vendor, the company, to turn around and say, hey, I'm going to have this type of user experience regardless if I'm, working throughout from a global perspective. You also need to think about, there's a lot of great technology that has been put into play. We just append to it and add on. We're not telling you to get rid of your existing infrastructure. It's not something that you want to, because you're always going to harden your infrastructure. You're going to harden what's happening, and what's going on. But you want to be able to add to it and really think more from the device perspective. And that's one of the key areas that Eris has been able to really focus on lately.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so just looking at time, I think this will probably be our last question. So Shri, I'd like to get your thoughts on this. I mentioned it in the beginning, and obviously we've had a lot of conversation here, good advice from some very experts in the space, thought leadership. What is IMC as an organization doing to help make and drive awareness? And then also maybe more practical advice about what to do, really. Like, where do you put your money and your budgets in 2025 to help start to tackle some of these things?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So till now, all of a good chunk of the standards have been very vertical oriented. They've been per industry and so on. But what we've seen from the regulatory side is that with the CRA and so on, it's very horizontal. And so now, and just as you were mentioning, right, there are some core standards like NIST2 and the NIST that have been added into that. So there's a lot of commonality that we can actually take and we can make it practical. So IMC is partnering with GCF, which is a global certification forum, and we've created a joint task force to actually explore how we can create practical guidelines to make sure that we can have the IoT ecosystem adopt those practical guidelines to be secure and also be compliant with CRA and all the other emerging regulations around it.
Awesome, thank you.
And this joint task force is open to the membership, and so we would welcome more members to actually come in and participate in that. So you can contribute your ideas and see how we can take existing standards and make it more tailored to what we want to do.
Great, thank you. Well, as I mentioned, this was a very quick session with a lot of topics to cover. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you to all the panelists for coming here, for sharing your expertise and bringing the conversation to light a bit more. So we'll be here staying after. I think the next session starts in about 20 minutes. So feel free to come up to us and ask any more questions or feedback. Always welcome to that. And again, here's a list of some of the member companies of the IMC. If you have questions about IMC, happy to answer that too. Love to have more people in the conversation. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the show.